Hey everybody, how's everybody doing today? So hopefully everybody can hear me okay and everything is going well. So please let me know if you're having any audio issues or anything today. I know sometimes the streaming software is a little bit weird. So try to type in here and make sure that everybody's asking questions today. And all right. So today's topic, we're going to, diverge a little bit, and we're going to talk about the life of a game designer today. And so, with that, I've put together just a really, really, really simple presentation. So please don't judge me on this one. I think I spent at least 30 seconds making this presentation, and but what I want to do is talk about all the different types of roles of being a game designer, and and what it's like to just be a game designer from kind of a day in and day out perspective. Um, Hi, thanks for coming, and glad you're here. So, Drawn Skull, nice of you to join us. So today, I want to try to answer as many questions as I can for everybody out there of what being a game designer is like. I'm going to try and talk about what it's like to do that job day in and day out, and talking about kind of the hundreds of different, not hundreds, but dozens of different job roles there are within the job description of being a game designer, right? And so, but first of all, every company is a little different. Every job description is a little different. Everybody's a little different in how they define game designers and what the game designer role does. And so I'll try to talk about all these different nuances that kind of vary from company to company, across the industry. Some of it's genre to genre. Some of this is things that are different from online teams, and games that are like in live operations versus games that are in development. Some of this is different from indie teams to AAA teams. And so you'll get a lot of different variances in your the role of game designer. Can change a lot depending on a lot of different variables there, right? And so we'll try to talk about all that today and try to kind of give you guys just kind of a really good example of kind of what those jobs are. I'll try to bring up some examples to show you. I've shown some of this in the weeks past on a few classes, so bear with me if you're one of my loyal repeaters that's coming back every week. Thanks for being here for me. I'll try not to bore you too much, but I want you guys to kind of see and understand what is the job like, and is it something that interests you? Is it something you want to do? Or even just if you're an artist or you're an engineer and you're here today and you have no intention of ever becoming a game designer, I think it's important that you understand what a game designer does. It's good for you to understand the role that a game designer plays in the team, and how do you work with that person? Because I think that's sometimes the challenge in a lot of teams is how does a game designer and an artist or an engineer work together, and who is responsible for doing what, right? And that can vary tremendously from day to day, but I'll try to explain some of those nuances to you as we dive in here. So, Drawn Skull, as a person who wants to do computer animated movies and create video games, what classes would you recommend to me? I'm planning on doing 3D modeling first. So, it says, I have a passion for filmmaking, animation, and video game design. So, Drawn Skull, that's a long topic. Let me try to answer you in briefly. But please, if I don't answer your question like 100% fully today, please feel free to reach out to me, personally, and I'll be more than happy to talk to you more, even one-on-one, myself, or some others at CG Spectrum, within like Jeremy, who does 3D modeling, or any of the people that do some of these other areas within the school. If you have more interests, I'll put my school email here really quick. But please feel free to again, reach out, for anybody here. If you have questions about becoming a game designer or doing another role, I'm always happy to talk to you. And I know that lots of our mentors would be more than happy to talk to you and help you understand it. And the reason I'm saying that is that the question is very big. It's very broad, right? And so the skill sets that you need for filmmaking, animation, are more in alignment. Now, that does not mean that cannot 100% transfer over to game design, but being a game designer, as you'll learn in today's talk, is a very different set of skill sets. It's a very different set of role. And so what you're going to learn there in your 3D modeling, for example, and things like that, those are things that will make you a better game designer for sure. Like, the more that you know in game design, whether it's in art, programming, whatever, the better game designer you're going to be. And so you definitely can be a better game designer if you study 3D modeling and animation and concept drawing, sketching. Like, all those areas will help you be a better game designer. But in the same hand, the game designer skills, which I teach in my course, are drastically different from what you're going to learn in 3D modeling or something. And so so to start with, there's the art side, right? And we'll get into this a little bit more in this whole class talk, but let me try to answer you really briefly. When you're making a movie, there's a lot, there's a lot that you're going to need to do visually, right? And so as an artist, we'll put you in the category, and this thing is very broad as an artist. So whether you're making 3D models, whether you're doing sketching, whether you're putting together, entire animated movies by yourself, or whether you're part of a team, that's that visual side of like making something look really good. Now, as a game designer, you're also, and especially as like a level designer, you're often doing that exact same thing. You're building worlds, you're building universes, you're designing characters at some levels. Now, that job will often split between what does an artist do and what does a game designer do, right? The game designer is really the guy who's about fun, and the artist is really about how does it visually look. And those two can be very intermixed because a game designer may be worried about functionality. So it's this old saying, like form versus function, right? So an artist is worried about the form, how does something look, versus a game designer is more usually concerned about the function. Like, is it going to be a big, strong character, that has a gun and, and shoots a certain way and has certain skills and abilities, and maybe it's got a jump jet or it's got something that's there, because these are the things as a game designer that we want to have to make this thing fun. Versus an artist is more concerned about like, hey, does it look really cool? Right. And so there's those slight line differences there that you have to sort of deal with in between what an artist does and what a game designer does. And so in short, a game designer is really about making things fun. And that's the basis for what we're doing. We're the ones creating the systems and the gameplay and the worlds and those things. And then the artist is the one that visualizes those things and makes them come to life. And so especially if you're at a smaller like indie studio or something like that, a smaller team will need to have more of a jack of all trades. So yourself, since you're looking at potentially two different areas, being an artist and being a game designer, you have to kind of understand that, it can be great to be both, but you also can sometimes become too much of a jack of all trades. And so the danger there is that game design already has a million skills that you need to learn. An artist is already something that I can't say it's easy to learn. I was a 3D artist. If you guys don't know, my initial career in Hollywood, I worked for 7 years doing Hollywood visual effects as a 3D modeler, 3D artist, animator, and then I worked in games as an art director. That's how I got started. I started as an artist and then became a game designer. So I do know a little bit about what I'm talking about. I have had that transfer of knowledge there at some levels. But you do need to be careful that, again, if you try to be the best 3D modeler and the best artist in the world and try to be the best game designer, you may be in trouble, right? Because both of those are really complicated. Both of those require a lot of practice and, and stuff. So just be careful when you're trying to fit those two areas together, because again, it's form and function that you're looking at with these two types of roles. And so it definitely can be a huge benefit to be able to visualize your ideas as a game designer. But just be careful about going too broad, there. And so it may initially help you to focus on one particular area and then add the other skills in. So start with maybe being an artist and then learn how to become a game designer. But that does not mean you can't do both together, but just be aware that it can definitely be difficult. And I know that, with this stream, I try not to talk up CG Spectrum. This is not about, my program at school there. I'm definitely here to answer questions for you guys, but this is not a sales tool, right? So I don't want to get salesy here and try to talk you into, being in the game design program. But one of the differences in my program compared to most other schools and things is that I try to focus you on being a great game designer first, and then teach just really basics on like the art side and the engineering side of developing games. But I find that a lot of other schools try to kind of equally teach you like how to do art, how to do game design, and how to do engineering. And what you end up with then are these super jack of all trades peoples. They're really not good at anything, and they're not strong enough game designers for me to ever hire. And so they ultimately kind of fumble around because they just don't have the skill sets they need to really become a great game designer or an artist or an engineer. And they're just kind of generalists that maybe do stuff like that. So John Skold, no, I did not work on Jak and Daxter. I worked on Ratchet and Clank. So a competitive game to those. And so the Ratchet and Clank games were also kind of a action platforming game, if you guys don't know, similar to Jak and Daxter. Jak and Daxter initially was a little bit, I would say, more focused on its combat and tended to be a little bit more heavy combat focused. And the Ratchet and Clank games tend to be a little bit more on their platforming puzzle elements. And then I think over time they sort of, started to merge, and the Jak and Daxter franchise sort of died out. Ratchet and Clank has stayed fairly strong and they're still making new ones as of today. But I worked on a few of the Ratchet and Clank games. And so you probably can see even behind me there, there's a bit of a Ratchet and Clank poster up on my wall there. That was for the Tools of Destruction on PlayStation 3. So that was the first Ratchet and Clank game on PS3 that I was the lead on. So anyways, so Drawn Skull, let me dive into this presentation. I'm not ignoring you at all, and we'll definitely keep answering your questions, but I believe I'll be answering this question for you the best I can as we dive into this presentation a little bit. So please bear with me, but please keep asking questions. I love it. And again, if I don't answer yours or anybody else's questions, please reach out to me, and I'm more than happy to talk to you, about it. So let's, talk about kind of, first of all, I wanted to kind of address this because I think a lot of people have been asking about kind of the game design jobs, in today's environment and what it's like to sort of work during this time of COVID and kind of this work from home and remote working and things like that. And what I can say is that the opportunities for being a game designer, I think, are really strong right now. There's still, our industry is still booming. We're seeing more M&A money, so more investment money. People that are coming in and buying companies, investing in companies, and strengthening companies than we've ever seen. Like, we're hitting record highs right now. We're seeing that as an industry, our revenue is up. I think it's like almost 200% now, total. And so that has allowed the industry to thrive, right? So it really is maybe one of the best times to ever get into games and game development and being a game designer. I'm seeing a tremendous amount of jobs in that area, happening right now. But what's interesting is that a lot of these jobs have transitioned. A lot of these jobs have transitioned now to be kind of work from home. And so even these massive studios like Ubisoft and things like that, like one of our mentors is an amazing guy named Andre. He's He's the lead level designer on the Far Cry games. If you guys know, we've looked at like Far Cry 6, which they just announced, I believe it was last week. And he's the lead level designer on that. So super, super amazing guy. He's one of the mentors in our game design program. And but what's been interesting to see how they transition is their team size is, I don't know exactly. I believe it's well over 500 people, probably more like 700 people, and they're all having to work from home. And so in one hand, everything is kind of the same, meaning you're on your same computer, you're working day in and day out, kind of the same, except for in the game design world, what's been a struggle is that game designers, to do our jobs right, have to be very communicative. And that doesn't mean that we can't do most of the same stuff on on video calls or texting back and forth or using other remote communication channels. We're learning to adapt to that. But game designers are always kind of we jokingly call us the chatty Cathys, of the industry. And and I've been, I think I've mentioned this before, I've literally been kicked out of, I can't tell you how many pits, areas where there's lots and lots of game members all in the same room, and the design team that I've been on has repeatedly been kicked out of those because we talk too much, and so, but it's our job. We have to talk, we have to discuss. It's not like we're talking about our personal lives or whatever. We're discussing the game designs, things like that. And it's kind of funny but it drives the engineers crazy because we talk all the time. And so that's been a hard adaptation in, even with, video conferencing and things like that, where we could log in and even have 10 of us in a video call together. It's been tricky to do remote work. Also, the amount of data that we have to work with is so massive, and everybody has different internet speeds. And so unless you have a super high speed internet at home, a lot of the designers are struggling because they have to check in and check out constantly to work this massive amount of data, which could be, gigabytes or even terabytes of data at any one time. And most of our home internets don't work that fast. And then there was VPN issues for security and these kinds of things. And so the game design jobs, while they are thriving and adapting, I think in this world, are definitely being challenged, in today's society. But I think there still is more and more companies beginning to get in processes and pipelines and procedures and things in place so that game designers can more easily work at home. And we may see this as becoming our new norm. And, I think there's a lot of people thinking that way. My cousin is actually an art lead at a company called Undead Labs, which Undead Labs has done a game called State of Decay. And an amazing game. If you guys haven't played it, please go check it out. I'll pimp their game a little bit. State of Decay is an open world zombie game. Absolutely great game. And it was a Xbox exclusive. I think there's a PC version on it now as well. But Microsoft recently last year bought Undead Labs, and so they're now part of Microsoft. And but my cousin Dave was the guy responsible for a lot of the environment art in that game. And he was telling me recently that even Microsoft is considering permanent work from home now and stuff. So I think a lot of companies in the game industry especially are seeing kind of this job and what we do as being possible remote. But I think, it'll be interesting to kind of see how things will happen, because we definitely have to understand how do we work in this highly creative environment, in this very social environment, that where we need to be able to have meetings and draw things out and stuff together. And that can be really tricky when you're remote, right? And that's one of the things that's I think been hardest for game designers. So we'll get back to that a little bit. If you guys have more questions on the state of the world today and how that's affecting game design, please ask. So Drawn's goal to start talking about this in general. What I want this slide, when I'm talking about here, is that there is, if you go to the job boards and you go look for, and let's just say you go to LinkedIn or whatever job board and you search for game designer, right? There is going to be a number of jobs that pop up that just say game designer, and they're just for a more generalized role. And so this this role, when we talk about, if you see a job, if you're going to a job board and you just see a job as game designer and nothing else more specific, you need to read the job description, first of all. I mean, for any of these you do, to see if they're wanting a specialty, if they're wanting, something that's there, or if this is a general role that they just want you to do a little bit of everything. And so let's talk a little bit about kind of the overall role of what a game designer does, to help Drawn Skull and the rest of you kind of understand the totality of a game designer's role. But we are going to talk about each sub job, each position that's fairly common, and that they're seeing, and kind of talk about all the different subspecialties as we dive into this. But let's first talk about the general role. So Kitty, welcome back. Thank you once again for being here. You're probably my most regular, so love having you here. And thanks for always asking lots of good questions. I think I think that was what I was playing a few weeks ago. So, I'm trying to remember now. I think that was the one I was playing a few weeks ago. So as a game designer, if you think about a video game, absolutely everything. I mean, 100% of everything that goes into a game must be something that is consciously thought of, right? And so it doesn't matter whether you are thinking about, can I run? Can I jump? Do I walk? Do I crawl? Do I swim? Do I fly? Do I shoot? All of these things, like every single thing that you do as a player, every single thing that an AI character, an NPC or something does is something that somebody somewhere, sometime, somehow thought of, right? These things don't just kind of randomly pop up into existence, right? And in the same regard, like everything has to be designed visually. And so there's a gray area that we'll get into a little bit more when we talk about the specialties, but all that stuff also has to be visually designed. Now, sometimes that's fully the role of an artist, but sometimes there's this role, again, like we talked about a minute ago, form and function. And so, as a game designer, are you ultimately setting a vision for what you want the artist to create? Or, how does your team work? And it can really vary a lot from kind of team to team. And this is where you have to kind of try to understand like what your team needs, from you. Do they want really specific stuff? Or do you just, for example, I've been on teams where, let's just say, I'll just say I need 10 enemies, and they'll just go off, and the artist will just go off and sketch 10 enemies, and they'll just come up with whatever wild and crazy ideas they want. And they'll kind of know what's appropriate for the IP or the brand or whatever the game is going to need. And they'll just kind of do all that on their own. But most of the time, even the artist will want some direction. They'll maybe want a sentence, a paragraph, some bullet points, maybe a one-pager. They might want you to Google some, even like a reference to say like, well, here's, some of the stuff that we want you to do, or whatever. But either way, the game designers quite often, but not always, but quite often give direction for where the visuals of the game are going to go. What's this world going to look like? How big is this world? What the weather and the environment's like, all this kind of stuff. And so game designers do get involved in both the gameplay systems as well as the visual look and kind of the direction of how those things are going to work. Again, how these levels are going to be built. Are they interiors, they exteriors, all that kind of stuff. And depending on the genre of game, you're going to get more and more involved in all those little minutia details, right? Just every little thing has to sort of matter. Now, there's lots of other secondary stuff though that also a game designer is going to get involved in, like the audio. I mean, even the music that's playing and how creepy it is, or the types of sound effects. Do I want really heavy footsteps? Do I want light footsteps? What is the ambiance and the nuance that I'm giving you? So it's not unlike a movie director. And there's usually in games a creative director, which we'll talk about at the end of this, about that. And I talked about that last week. So if you guys don't know what a game's creative director is, that was actually my last week's talk was all about being a creative director. And so please, Drawn Skull, you might enjoy watching that because that might have some relevance to you. So please look up, there should be a saved version of that talk here on Twitch that you can look up, and that will give you some good ideas about some of the differences between sort of artistic lead and the design lead, and kind of this gray area of being kind of the equivalent of a movie director, and how that might help you. So that particular video I think might help you the most. But as a game designer, again, just every single little thing has to be understood, and there's stories, and there's dialogue, and there's quests, and there's things you earn, and there's all sorts of stuff like that goes into a game, right? And so as a generalized game designer, you may be somebody that's just responsible for everything, and so this is generally true on smaller teams. And so if you're working for a smaller company, if you're working more for an indie or whatever it is, there's times and places that they want generalists. And so this could be somebody who's working on system designs. You could be working on level design. You could be working on, monetization strategies. There's no limit to what a general game designer or a generic game designer could potentially work on. And it really just depends on potentially what your skill set is, and what the other teammates' skill sets are, and sometimes just what does that company need you to do. And that company might want you to come up with whole ideas on your own. You might be working within an existing brand. There's all sorts of stuff there within making a game as a game designer that potentially you might need to do. It might be all the way from the concept of something, all the way through the prototyping of it, all the way through the final implementation of it, and all the way into live operations. It might be something that you might be working on for years. Even after it's kind of quote unquote complete, you might still be balancing it. You might still be, changing the stats and making sure, that it plays, just right. So Drawn Skull, there's really not a great answer there. I mean, I think that both of those reinforce each other, game design and 3D modeling. Which one is more important? Really, in the end, is going to depend on what you want, what your heart tells you. I think to be a game designer, you have to realize that this is a very challenging job. Not to say that 3D modeling or any of these jobs are easy, but being a game designer especially is very challenging. And like I said, if you take on too much, it's hard. And so you need to decide the role of a game designer is very diverse. So let me talk about that for a minute. So when you're designing games, and you're working, as a game designer, it's what makes it exciting to me personally is that, every day, not every day, but a lot, most of my days are very different, right? I very rarely will do the same thing day in and day out and day in and day out. So we might have days or weeks that we're maybe say testing a level, and we might build a level and we're running around it and we're trying to make sure it's okay, and we're polishing some things and we're doing some stuff for some periods of time. But for the most part, like, we're constantly learning new things. We're constantly trying new things. We're constantly building new things. And so I love the job, especially because, it's just so diverse in what you do. And so it's not like, and it's also a very highly social job. And so you'll hear me say that a lot. And I like people to understand that the job of game designer really requires you to be, very, very, very social. And that's an important skill set that you have to really understand, because if you're not social, then being a game designer sometimes is the wrong place. And so you have to be somebody who's very agile, meaning just the ability to like jump on stuff right away and like not necessarily like plan it out. You want to be the kind of guy that's like, oh wait, today I'm working on this, tomorrow I'm working on this, and today I have the plan to work on this, and like, oh wait, something happened. Okay, now I'm going to work on something else, and you just you tend to bounce around a lot, and people either love that or hate that, right? And so the job of a game designer is just this constantly in flux, fluid sort of job, and that can be amazing for a lot of people if you enjoy it. But as an artist, and as a 3D artist especially, quite often it's I want to call it monotonous, because it's not. I mean, I enjoy my job. When I worked as a 3D modeler, I still enjoyed doing that. But you kind of do the same basic job every day. You come in, and you might have, you might be specialized in environments, you might be specialized in characters, maybe you do a little bit of everything. But you kind of sit and you come up with ideas. Maybe you have a concept artist that's feeding you ideas. Maybe you do it yourself. But you're going to sit and model that thing every day, right? And if you're a very generalized artist, maybe you concept it, maybe you do 3D modeling, maybe you rig it, maybe you animate it, and maybe you can do the whole pipeline for it. But it's still kind of the same job, right? And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But you have to decide, what do you like to do, right? What is in your heart? What do you enjoy doing every single day? And are you the kind of person that really just likes to sort of sometimes go nose down and be focused on what you're doing? Or do you like, being kind of the really open and a little bit chaos, and you're kind of, bouncing around a little bit and stuff. And yeah, there's times and places where you focus as a game designer, but it's definitely not like go in my office, lock the door, shut myself away for weeks and months while I build something kind of job like an engineer or an artist sometimes does. And so that's the first most important question, is really, who do you want to be and what do you want to do, right? And so I'm happy to talk to you more, Drawn Skull, about that, down the road. But you really have to soul search yourself to really understand, what do you want, right? And so being able to create the worlds, the characters, the vehicles, weapons, style, story, that kind of stuff. Yes, like I said, it's a double-edged sword that really varies by company. And so there's the person who might describe those things like in text, right? Who is creating those things and coming up with those ideas and kind of driving those things from a creative standpoint. That's what a creative director does. And so again, my last week's talk, we'll cover some of that. So the world building around building a world is often the job of like a creative director or people that are doing the world building and stuff. But then, like I said, at some point that does get handed off to an artist usually. So occasionally there's a game designer, an artist, or the same person. They can do both roles. But you'll find that both those can be very segregated. And again, the bigger the company, the wider apart those roles are going to be. So at a smaller indie company or a smaller project, you're going to have more creative ability. But that might mean that your ability to be a game designer and an artist, and if you want to really create the whole thing, may be better at smaller companies versus at big companies. So those kinds of things, you really have to really take to heart. And so that's why when you say that create the worlds, create is kind of it's a tough category, right? Because you're, creating is a team effort, right? And so you'll never 100% be the guy in most teams. I can't say always, but you'll rarely be the guy that creates everything from scratch. You're always generally working with a team. There's generally some people that are there that you're going to come up with an idea and then implement that idea. And again, if you have a background in 3D modeling and game design, yes, you might be able to do 100% of that, but most people don't. And so that's kind of, again, that idea of creating stuff is important to understand. Again, what do you want to do, and how do you want to do it? So I would, just off the top of my head, Drawn Skull, I would guess that the more you understand the initial concept of what you need to design is more important. It is more important initially, because if you don't understand, for example, let's just say you want to draw a big creature, a big character, right? Like as an artist, you can work for days, weeks, months, years to create like the coolest looking art you've ever seen, and everybody in the world could look at that piece of art and think you're a grandmaster and you're the most skilled artist in the entire world. And you'd show that to like a game designer to use in a game, and he may scratch his head and go like, I can't use it. Like it's not fun. It doesn't work. It doesn't function, right? It's like, it's too big for my game, or it's too complicated. I can't animate it correctly. I can't, the skeletal systems aren't going to work for what I need it to do. It doesn't have the right kinds of attacks or weapons and that kind of thing, right? So at some levels, whether you're an artist or a game designer, where you start with creating and world building, where you're going to start is in trying to understand what you need to do and why you need to do it. And then from there, you can visualize it. So by starting as a game designer, you're going to have a better idea of understanding what and why you should design something. And then, really it's about, how do I make it, make it look a little bit better, right? So that's that delicate balance there. And so, yeah, Eli's, Eli's in my program, is one of my game design students here, so I'll call him out. He's been an incredible student so far, and has been really great at asking lots of questions and stuff. So, but yeah, Eli dreams really big and has some amazing ideas for how stuff is going to be done, and so I love the fact that he really is a great at questioning kind of what things should be like and are going to be like, and kind of trying to think outside the box there. So he's been a great asset to my program. I've been very happy to have him in it. And so, yeah, hopefully, he also maybe can answer some questions for you there. But yeah, he's getting a taste right now of what it's like to be a game designer and just how hard it is. And so it's tricky because, again, you're taking like lots of different skill sets and putting them together as a game designer. And so it's a tricky business. So, Ron School, I mean, the trick with having your own business is that, in my personal opinion, in my experience, is that ideas are a dime a dozen. And so ultimately, being able to execute on those ideas and be able to get them, into the game, into the whole thing, is the most important thing. And so you can be the most talented 3D modeler, you can be the most talented game designer, you can be the most talented of anything in any area, but in the end, you're either going to be, as an individual, if you have your own company, you could be a consultant maybe who's trying to come up with ideas. But the problem is that the creative directors and the people that are the leads on the projects, like if you go to a bigger company, they're the ones who want that job, right? You're talking about like how do I get to that top job? I want to be the idea guy, right? I want to be that guy that comes up with these worlds and things. So until you can earn your way up that ladder, everybody kind of wants that job. And so nobody is going to hire, this is the honest reality, and I don't want to, sorry if I burst your bubble here, but the reality is nobody's going to hire you to be a creative director day one, because that's what the creative directors spent the last 10 years proving themselves so they could become that guy, because they want to create the worlds. They want to do that kind of stuff, right? And so you're ultimately going to have to get into a role and start proving yourself, and more kind of prove yourself and show what you can do, and then figure out how to make that happen. Now, as an independent, contractor, or having your own company, now whether that's yourself and just as a consultant, or whether you're working, trying to actually start up a whole team, in the end, that takes money, right? And that's the harshest reality with making games, is in the end, it's a business. And so the challenge that we face in making games is that we have to make, this a business, right? And so, making games could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions and millions of dollars, right? And so if it's our own company to make like an entire game or a movie or whatever, ultimately somebody has to pay for that, right? We need an investor. We need people that are going to pay for that. And so if you don't have a track record, if you don't have experience and things like that, nobody's going to hire you as a company or as an individual to help them necessarily create worlds. Now, I do know lots of writers. I do know lots of concept artists. I do know lots of people that augment existing teams and do help them create the worlds. But I don't know anybody who's ever gone into, even at my level, even with my almost 30 years experience, like for me to go into an outside company and say like, hey, let me create a whole new game idea for you. Let me create a whole new game world for you. And let me do that for you. Very, very few companies would allow me to do that. Because again, their own teams and their own people, want to do that work. Right. And so that's something that you have to kind of figure out is, how do you have your own business and what do you mean by that? And then what role could you realistically have, in when you're doing that, right? And so that's the crux of the problem. That's the reality, is that, we all want to be the idea guys. We all want to be the people that are in there creating worlds, world building, coming up with new characters and stories and all that kind of stuff. But ultimately, we all need to pay our dues, so to speak, to get to that level, right? And so at some levels, please don't expect that you're going to get there day one. and again, there's always exceptions, but you have to figure out, as a game designer or a world builder or whatever that is, what do you mean by that? Like, what do you want to do? And maybe focus it on a particular area, something that you're exceptionally good at. So Sean says, I mean, shouldn't that be the way? Question mark. Someone with 10 years or more should be the creative director of a game. Heck, yeah. I mean, it's really hard. And yes, in general, you would think that companies would want people like me. And again, they might hire people like me to fill that role. So like companies will hire me to be a creative director and to fill that role full-time in-house. But that's a totally different thing than somebody coming to me and saying like, hey, we've got something, we want, you to design it for our team. Like we have, because again, a game takes a team to make, right? This is not an individual sport. You require a team to make. So a third-party company would never come to me and say, hey, we want you to just on the side or freelance or whatever, come up with a game idea, build this whole world, build all this stuff, and then and then give it to us and we'll go make that game. I mean, every once in a while, maybe. But I mean, that's very, 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 very rare. Again, the team itself wants that job, wants that role, wants that ability. And whether they have 1 year experience or 100 years of experience, doesn't matter. That's the job that they're going to want to try and do. And to try to just hire an external company to do that for them does not happen very often. And again, occasionally that kind of stuff will happen. There's a couple companies out there in Hollywood that do some specialty stuff where they build IPs and they build some brands, but they usually take existing brands and flesh them out into bigger worlds versus coming up with something from scratch. I believe they're called Starlight Runner, if I remember the name correctly. Jeff Gomez, I think was his name. Jeff and Brian Gomez. They had a company that was doing something like that that I thought would be cool as hell to be able to do, because their whole job was just basically creating worlds all day. But they fleshed out like Halo and a bunch of other, things. But but it's very different. Yeah, Sean. So it's disastrous as well in the sense that you want your creative leads to be part of the core team. You want them to be in-house. You want them to to be really part of that core experience. And when they're not, it is disastrous because they're not going to be close enough to the whole thing, and you just can't design in a vacuum. And I think that's the mistake that some people think, that they can just sort of say like, oh, well, I'm going to design this thing, and then I'm going to create this like design document, or I'm going to create some design specification, and I'm just going to hand it off to people and say, hey, you go do that. Like, that doesn't work. You need to be part of that team from day one through the end. And that's the way a real creative director needs to be. And they have to be the leader of the team. They have to be the person that's driving the team. And whether that team is 5 people or 500 people, that creative director needs to be that center person, right? And so that's why, as a third-party company, you would never hire somebody like that, because it just isn't something that would really work very well. But Drawn School, to answer your question, game design transferable to animating films? Yes and no. I mean, so both are about building worlds. Both of them are about learning how to write stories and building stories. Both of them are about building interesting characters. But a movie or an animated film or whatever it is, something that's non-interactive. So remember, games are interactive. That's what makes them so bloody hard, right? And so a game might be a 10 or 20 hour non-linear interactive experience, right? And so that is a very, 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 very difficult thing to design and build. And so in actuality, a less or a linear thing, meaning a movie, TV show, whatever it is generally a 10 or 100 times easier, because it's linear and you're writing a script, and then from that script you're developing out stuff. And so you go through some of the same process, meaning that world building. How do you write an interesting story? How do you create interesting characters? How do you create interesting worlds? How do you progress through arcs of things? And all that kind of stuff. How do you engage users? You have to look at the competition, understand all these different things, right? So that skill in movies and games are very similar. But that being said, I've also worked with some of the best Hollywood guys, in the world, and I'm very proud to have been friends with, Steven Spielberg and George Lucas and John Milius and like some of the greatest directors, in the world. I was taught to direct by James Cameron, and so I literally have worked with the best of the best, and I've been very fortunate in my career to have had that ability to work with some of the best Hollywood guys in the world. And all of them have tried at one point or another to come to games. And I've worked with all of them as they've tried to come to games themselves. And some of them have hired great teams. Jim and Steven and these people have gone on to hire teams of people or built companies to make the games for them. But when they themselves tried to go from making movies and TV shows and animated movies into making games, 100% of them all failed. And so every Hollywood director, every Hollywood writer that I've ever worked with, minus a couple exceptions, have failed when they came over to games. I think one of the few that did well was Danny Bilson. You guys may not know Danny. He's not a household name, but he wrote movies like The Rocketeer, and he wrote and directed hundreds of TV shows and stuff like that. He ultimately got a job at EA, and was one of the creative leads at EA for a very long time, overseeing all their licensed stuff, and then went on to be the head of THQ for a long time. And now Danny is actually kind of my competitor, I guess. I don't know. He's still one of my best friends and love him to death, but he's head of the USC game design program there. But he's also one of the few people that went from having kind of a Hollywood background into games and succeeded. But people like Danny are very few and far between. And I think Danny succeeded because he was a gamer, and he understood the rules there. But it's easier to go from being a game designer at some levels to building movies, because but it's still a slightly different language, right? It's kind of like, I'm trying to think of the best analogy. Like, you'll see that like when I create games, I do a lot of directing. And in fact, here, I'll show you guys something I did. Let me show you an example here. So let me show you I had a few things here pulled up, just show you. So this, as a game designer, what I want to show you here is, this was let's see if I can find it here. I'll show you a couple different ones. This was a cutscene out of the movie, the video game, sorry, Where the Wild Things Are. If you guys ever saw the movie, directed by Spike Jonze, I directed the video games for it, both for console and for DS and stuff like that. And so I directed a lot of cutscenes, which are basically movies for the games. And so this is an example of where there's a direct one-to-one correlation in my skill and my ability as a game director, that would be exactly 100% the same as a movie director. And so I did everything from, I came up with the idea, I wrote it down on paper and words, I then wrote out a script. I did some for myself. I'm not a great artist, so I did some rough storyboards, and then I sat with my storyboard artist, and he storyboarded out these things, and then from there, I brought in a 3D team, and the 3D team did all the 3D stuff, and I oversaw it and made sure everything was the way I wanted it. And so this was very much the same as being a movie director. All right, bear with us. Sure why it's going so slow? Where normally it goes super fast here. All right. That is weird. All right, that was weird. So here's another one. Huh. I guess Google is having some problems today. I've never seen this before. I apologize. Normally this works 100% of the time. Let me just download them really quick.
Despero was a mouse
Right
who
here.
in his own mind was a giant.
Don't worry, Mom. I'll be right back with supper.
A mouse who found the castle of Dor and the world around it to be a place of wondrous adventure. Despero was a gallant mouse who didn't do what was expected of him, but was someone who saw the wonderful castle of Dor as a place of adventure.
Oops. Mouse! Kill it!
Other mouse was afraid of everything, but Despero didn't know he was small.
So, to answer your question, that's exactly what you're talking about. This was actually me as a game designer working on a licensed IP with a movie called The Tales of Despero, which was an animated movie. I was doing the game based on an animated movie, but I had to make some cutscenes that were animated movies inside my game that matched the animated movie, right? So I had to direct that whole thing. I had to figure out every camera angle, every shot, that whole thing came from me, not from, the movie or anything like that. We had to match, that. So it's very different. Let me show you one more here. This was from Where the Wild Things Are. For some reason the audio is not playing here. I apologize, but at least you can kind of see the So again, another example of me making a cutscene movie based on an animated movie, right? This is actually the final cutscene of the game on the PlayStation 3 version. So this was, if you won the game, this was the animated cutscene that you got, for the movie, for the game. So anyways, so I gave you guys a little bit of an idea of just some stuff, of what it's like. One of the roles of a game designer is to really direct these things. In fact, let me show you one more, just because I want you to see the process. And so let me look, my internet connection's pretty fast here. So some of you might know the movie 300. And this is this was a gameplay mock-up that we were in process of doing for a sequel. We were doing a video game sequel to the 300. So it was not based on the original movie, the 300, but this was based on what we wanted the kind of the sequel, which was going to be the game to be. And so I directed this as well. But you can see that we started with we first started with a script, and then we went in and created a flat shaded version of this. And the development team, which was in Japan, called Game Republic, Brash Entertainment was where I worked and was one of the partners at Brash. We were the ones helping design this. But we see here some some final renderings. This is what the final art was going to look like, but we hadn't put the whole thing together yet. And so again, we were working to refine in this wire shaded view kind of the, what this thing was going to look like, what the camera angles were going to look like, what the story was, what the dialogue was going to be, all that kind of stuff. And so you can see that these are all the soldiers, the Spartan soldiers. This video was taking place, or sorry, the story, I guess, for this is taking place just a few years after that. You see this guy has a patch over his eye. If you remember the first movie, there was a character named Delios who was the only character who lived through the movie 300. He's the narrator and the one telling the story. And in this particular case, Delios is he's in this game. He's gone up to Persia and he's attacking the Persians in their home country, and he's trying to slow them down before they can attack Greece again. So that was kind of the premise for this whole thing. And so I won't bore you with the whole thing, but just to kind of show you again that there's a process there that's can be important to understand. So drawn scale consoles I'm excited for. Honestly, I'm not. I mean, every console to me is just another device. It's just another thing. And so it's really, really easy to get caught up in this, like, oh, which one's better? Xbox, PlayStation, PC, mobile, whatever, VR, AR, whatever. To me, there's platforms. I've been doing this, my first game was on the Super Nintendo that I designed. I designed games for the Atari Jaguar, for early DOS PC games and things like that. So I've literally worked on almost every single platform. I think I didn't work on the NES. I didn't work on a couple, maybe the original Sega platform, but I pretty much worked on I've shipped games on pretty much every platform, right? So for me as a game designer, I've learned to kind of abstract out every console because to me they're all exciting. Like each one presents an opportunity. Each one presents new challenges, new levels of graphics, new things that I can do in my job. But I've kind of gotten tired of like trying to get overly hyped because I feel like that a lot as a game designer, a lot of these consoles have gotten too obsessed with graphics and they've really forgotten about how to make great, fun games. And that's what, I keep trying to preach to say, like, if you look at game design and game designers and what we've been doing, and look at like the state of like the best games that are out there today, like Horizon Zero Dawn or The Witcher 3 or whatever game is like, Call of Duty, whatever's your favorite game today. Now, like rewind back, 5 years, rewind back 10 years, 20 years, like how much has game design really evolved over the generations of the consoles? Now the exceptions being, I think the Nintendo stuff being the best example where the Nintendo, for better or for worse, has tried really, really hard to make game design more forefront in the technology of the consoles, with, and some of that was really hard, like the Wii, and you're doing this and stuff like that. We've kind of forgotten that game design and fun, to me personally, and I know I'm a little biased because I'm a game designer, right? But I think that's personally, I would much rather have a really fun game than a really pretty game. And I still feel like that Sony and Microsoft especially are a little bit guilty about pushing us towards graphics first and not about gameplay first. And so that's why I'm a little bit jaded, and I'll admit it, but I do think that I think there's still a lot as an industry we can do to make games better and more fun, for people. And I think that's the job of a game designer, right? The job of a game designer in the end, if you boil it down to one word, is fun, right? That's what we have to know. But it's a very abstract thing to know what fun is, because fun is not quantitative. Fun is like, oh, well, I think it's fun, and then the guy next to me, may think it sucks. And, and it's not quite as clear. Whereas like with art, it's a little bit clearer, like, which way to go, right? And so it really it's really a difficult challenge, right? So that's the problem. And then like with coding, with engineering, it either works or it doesn't work, right? And so it either works at like the right speed or the right frame rates, and it's bug free. So it's a lot easier to quantify whether code is good or bad. is a little subjective, yes. But I think once an art director establishes a style, the art is either meets that style and works with it, or it doesn't. But for the most part, you know if your art works or not. Game design is always really, really, really subjective. And that's why the job of a game designer and that role of a game designer is really challenging. So, Drawn Skull, I don't know. I need to talk to you, in all honesty. So let's plan on setting up a one-on-one call, this week, if you'd be up for that. I'd love to talk to you because I need to know more, right? I can't do recommendations without knowing you, right? And I really want to know what inspires you and what there, and I don't want to waste, we've got other people here that I'd like to talk to as well. And, I'm going to answer your questions, but please, it will take it'll take us an hour to talk one-on-one just to even really get at the heart of what, I think you really need to know as far as which classes and stuff like that. So if you don't mind, let's try to table that particular question. Please ask others. But I think that's a really big question that we don't have the time here. And I don't want to, I want to be, cognizant of everybody else's time, right? So I want to try to dive in a little bit deeper into my talk now because we're an hour in and I haven't gotten past the first slide. So please bear with me and I apologize, but I do want to kind of move on here and keep going. So, one of the things to sort of understand a little bit, is that as leads and seniors and seniority, what the difference is like in these roles is you might see that there's like associate level jobs, there's junior level jobs, there's, just kind of like game designer job. And then there might be like, a senior to a lead, and so on and so forth. And so there's a hierarchy, right? And stuff. And so how do these different job roles change over time? And, as you get promoted or as things happen there, I can't answer the question fully because it's a little bit different, but I want you guys to sort of get a generalization of how, thanks, Drawn Skull, appreciate it. And look forward to talking to you privately. So the, as you rise up the ranks, as you go from kind of being a junior or associate, and you go to being just say a game designer to senior game designer or whatever, generally the obvious question is you get more responsibility, right? So you might take on a bigger piece of whatever you're designing, whether that's a full level versus a part of a level, or you might take on a full role or a full part of the game versus just part of the game. You might take on as like a lead designer, you might take on all of the gameplay systems. Now that doesn't mean that you design everything yourself. It could be. If you're a smaller indie team, a lead game designer might be the only designer, and you may just be the guy that's doing everything. So you may wear all those hats, right? But a senior designer might be under you, and you might have some junior designers under you. Because again, in most usual teams, a game is built by a team. And I want to keep stressing that because a game designer role is generally not a lone wolf kind of job, right? This is a job that you have to work with everybody. Your design teams, your art teams, your production teams, your engineering teams. You're the hub of this entire world of this game, right? And you're driving and pushing all of these people into all these different directions, right? And so if you're not, so ultimately as you get more skills, you get more experience and things, you're going to take on a bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger role over time. And you're going to quite often, again, not always, but quite often, you're also going to take on more reports and more people under you. And so like as a lead level designer, say on a small team, you might have 1 or 2 level designers under you. And then, but in like a big team, like I mentioned, one of our mentors, Andre at Ubisoft, I don't know what his total team count would be, but I wouldn't be surprised if he had 20 to 50 level designers under him, or at least even under another sub hierarchy. So you might be, say, lead level designer, and then you might have senior level designers under that, and those senior level designers might have some other level designers under them. And so there's a tree, there's a hierarchy, right? Because generally, as a general rule of thumb, you don't want to have more than like 5 to 10 people under you as direct reports, right? So you might have so somebody like Andre might have, say, 50 level designers, but he might only have 5 actually reporting to him. He might have 5 seniors that report to them, and then each of those guys has 5 or 10 guys that report to them, so on and so forth, because you don't want to have to manage too many people, especially if you're also trying to do your day job, in managing those people. And so just generally, if you're out job hunting, if you're out searching, and this is your first job in the industry, or you're kind of early on, be aware that there's kind of interns, design interns, junior and associate level type positions. Those are probably your easiest places to get in. And then, like I said, or just as a game designer type role, like you've gone through my first year course, you'd be capable of kind of going at those levels. It definitely takes some experience to get up, into the higher levels and stuff. But, again, just keep in mind that when you see these different job titles, and when you see titles like lead, senior, executive, whatever, there's lots of different things like that can happen. Those roles are typically, and I would say that the same is true with whether you're artist, engineer, designer, or other job titles. That the same generalization and philosophy that leads lead. Seniors still need to have some responsibility. Another thing that's important here, and why I'm mentioning this is when you're learning these things, part of what makes us successful as game designers, especially, but the same thing would be if you're an artist or an engineer. Part of what makes us successful in rising up through the ranks is not just our skill at doing our job, right? Our skill ultimately is also the soft skills that go along with that. Can we pitch to people? Can we talk to people? Can we manage people? Can we run meetings? Are we good at, that day-to-day, management and having empathy towards our teammates and learning how to be a good boss, being a good manager, being a good director? Like those kinds of soft skills are absolutely critical. So no matter what job role or job title you're in, if you expect to or hope to become a lead or a senior, and you don't have good soft skills, go learn those, right? And really get better at those. And then there's some secondary soft skill type things, or kind of, I guess, a little bit of a hard skill, but things like just management and project management in general. Now, you may have producers, you may have development directors, you may have people on your team who ultimately are running the schedules. But another thing that you will see is quite often the leads and the senior type roles will be micromanaging the schedules of the people under them. So a producer, for example, might only come to, say, the lead designer, and then the lead designer is responsible for knowing and building and managing and maintaining his entire team's schedule. So that really varies company to company a lot. But just be aware of having a generalized knowledge. That's why I had a talk a few weeks ago about being a game producer. If you haven't seen that, Dream School, that might also be something you might also benefit from or see. But understand the job of a producer, when you become a lead or a senior, becomes even more critical, because you're going to interface with that producer, if not daily, probably hourly. And so you need to know what they do, and you need to know what you do. You need to know what everybody else on your team does, so that you know how to delegate. So you know how and where things are going. And then for your team, you need to be able to know, like, okay, for example, I need to start building this level, and I need my team, say, to start building this level, but I'm waiting, and maybe the artists are working on all the art. And if you don't understand the art production schedules and where those are coming, then you're going to be kind of like, well, I don't know when I can start. I don't know if that's tomorrow or next year or where that's going, right? And so the leads and these senior people also are expected to have some understanding of scheduling, schedule management, and really being able to manage at least their own schedules, if not a small team under them, and really understand that ramifications again of where things go, and then also just generalized knowledge. And I'd say that these things are good for all designers and all people to know. But even just basic stuff, like you get more responsibility when it comes to just making sure the project is running smooth. And so that could be, for example, even the pipelines, the processes, who's doing what. So for example, even when a piece of art is done, or when a level is done, and I always use done in quotes, because for me, done is never done until I see it in the game, 100% playable, bug fixed, and like, done. That's done. Done does not mean it's sitting on my computer and I can play it myself, and it feels good to me. Like, that's still in progress, right? And so these leads and seniors also need that ability to sort of know, like, okay, was this thing checked into the source control properly? Did it have the right naming conventions? Did it go up on the server in the right place? And they're managing their sub teams to really make sure that, like, even if something gets done and checked in, did you notify the right people? So you might say build out a white box for a level and then check that in. And maybe somebody under you checks that in, but did they notify the lead artist who's supposed to now work on that level? Does that person know that it got checked in? What's that process and pipeline? And so your leads and your seniors are also making sure that game, works day to day. So hopefully that makes a little bit sense, but let me move on along here. So game system designer, this is one of two primary roles that I teach in my course. In the course, I teach you to be a game system designer and a game level designer. The game system designer is the guy who basically decides, and now, again, this could be a single person, this can be, a dozen people, but this is the team and the people that build the minute-to-minute, second-to-second gameplay. How do I run? How do I jump? How do I shoot? How do I reload? How do I heal? All those kinds of things are, again, a conscious choice by somebody that they have to make, right? And so the game system designer is really that person who is working on paper. They're writing design documents. They're writing creative specs. They're doing things like that. This job, on a day-to-day level is really somebody who's, for at least the first half or 3/4 of the project, you're working in Microsoft Word, you're working in Excel or the Google equivalents. You're making presentations to present your ideas, to present things to each other. You might be working on spreadsheets, like you'd be the one involved in the economies of the games, the balancing of the games, like how many hit points do you have? What's your health? What's your recharge rates? What's the damage per second that this weapon is going to give you? All these kinds of things. There's a billion stats in some games, especially like RPGs, strategy games, stuff like that. So you're going to be working in like spreadsheet hell, writing formulas and stuff. And so this role, while it does not require a massive technical ability, it does benefit from having some technical skills. And you'll often also be somebody who's doing a lot of scripting, and that scripting could be in languages like Python, Lua, things like that. And we won't get into the differences between programming and scripting right now, but if you don't know, programming, is a much harder core, usually utilizing like C, C++, full computer languages, versus scripting is a much more simplified version that's using an interpreted language. It's either using a pure visual code or something that makes it a lot easier to do. And so it does help to be technical as a game system designer, but again, it's not required. But people that are a little bit more inclined towards like being engineers, or if you're really good at math and good at numbers and things like that, you'll thrive better as a gameplay system designer than others. But again, your job is a lot of building, designing these systems, thinking through what we call the edge cases. That's one of the hardest parts of the job. Like the job of a system designer seems like it's really easy sometimes at first glance. And where the real challenge of being a game system designer is finding what we call the edge cases. Find all these things that break the game. And like, oh, what happens if the player does this? What happens if the player does that? And like, oh, that doesn't work. Like, okay, that breaks everything. Crap, I got to start over. I'm going to build something else. And there's those kinds of things as a game system designer that is actually the hardest part of the job. It's that last 10%, that last 20%. You'd be surprised how many times like we put something together and we think it's going to be really solid, and then it just ultimately doesn't work very well. And so that's definitely a challenge for us. And so you do need to be kind of aware of that. You need to be, understand that, this is can be a very tedious job sometimes, because you're really like testing, especially like in a strategy game or something. You might have, let's just say, even 20 units, and they all have all these different stats, and you're gonna have to figure out like, well, which ones are good against which, and how they balance each other, and and you're gonna focus test it, and you're gonna bug test it, and you're gonna try all these things. Then you realize like, oh, that didn't work, and that wasn't fun, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of stuff there that is challenging as a game system designer. Now, the role of a combat designer is quite often, I would say I would guess 75% of the companies, I'll make a guess, are the game system designer and the game combat designer are often the same role. Now, where the game combat designer role starts to become independent and separate are games that are extremely combat heavy. And I actually wouldn't say that most first-person shooters, even though they're combat heavy, would even have a combat designer. They might. A few of them do. Bigger AAA teams for sure. But where you actually will find the role of combat designer more commonly, is that especially in like fighting games, third person like action games, things that have a lot of animation and things like that. You're going to need somebody who's very specialized. And I'll explain this for a little bit. I wish I had an example of a tool I could show you. I didn't think about finding that ahead of time, but I worked on a game called TNA Wrestling, for example, and it was a wrestling game, which, for all intents and purposes, is a fighting game. It's probably more challenging, I think, than some fighting games because one of the challenges in a wrestling game was grappling. So being able to grab people, hold on to them, and you had to know, like, if I perform an animation, like, how do I grab the person, like, on the shoulders here? Because if I'm just off by, like, a little bit, it would look weird. My hands go here, and, they're supposed to go here, or I want to hit the guy here, but, if I swing and miss, like, things have to align, things have to work right. And so a game combat designer was a role that we actually had, I believe, had 3 or 4 full-time combat designers on that game. And so what their job was to do is they worked in a very specialized tool. They would take, and this was a custom tool, even though we used the Unreal Engine as our base engine, but we actually spent, 8 months maybe writing a custom tool just to do the combat. And why that was so hard was we basically had to take every character and we had to bone them and skin them and have all their stuff on it. But then we had to be able to set up each animation and everything has to be very frame accurate. So the combat designer would say okay, on this frame, I'm going to play this animation, but I want this animation to go over, say, 8 frames. So you don't even want to say a second, because a second in game terms is 30 frames per second or something like that. And a lot of these animations are taking fractions of a second, and so we often use frame count, but we'll say okay, he's going to play this over a certain number of frames, but then you're setting up an interrupt where what happens if the other guy is going to block? So now you'd say okay, well, 8 frames in, there's a point where I'm either going to continue and I'm going to follow through, or at 8 frames, I get blocked. And so then at that point, then I play and I got hit back or something. It didn't quite work right. Or a counter, and then the second option might be that the other guy counters. So he could block me where, I'm going to go forward, I'm going to hit something and then come back or whatever. And then the counter might be, I'm going to go forward. And at some point he grabs my hand and now he pulls me forward and now I flip and I take damage, and so setting up every animation, setting up every little thing, frame by frame by frame by frame, it was a crazy job. And those guys really had a hard job because they had to go into every single animation, every single attack, every single counter, defense, just a run cycle. What happens if I'm starting to run and somebody trips me? What happens if I starting to run, I hit something? What happens if I start to do this? And just setting up every contingency and then knowing how to blend animations together. And then have to know okay, if I connect with this, how much damage is that? Is that, and then setting up all the damage multipliers and all the things that happen, with it. And so all that stuff is what a combat designer does typically. Now they could be a systems designer as well. And a system designer may be designing kind of the core base things. They may be determining how many animations you have or all these kinds of things, right? But the combat designer is really the guy who's implementing what a gameplay system designer has designed. And again, they could be the same person, but it's definitely a very specialized set of skill sets that you have to know how to work with animations, how to work with characters, and how to really make the combat system fun. But like I said, first-person shooters aren't typically involved in that because your combat systems are typically simpler. yes, you're shooting and you got guns and things like that, but those don't necessarily need to be a combat designer. So just hoping you guys kind of understand the differences between why you would want a combat designer, or the term that we would call a combat designer typically. Now, again, a really, really big team, if you go to Halo, or if you're going to go to Bungie and work on one of their games or something like that, when you're talking about teams that have hundreds and hundreds of people, then yes, you probably do have some dedicated systems designers who are focused on combat. But more often than not, when you see the term combat designer, you're really talking about somebody who's, again, implementing animations, things like that. And it's going to be something that's going to be in some sort of a combat animation, third person fighting game, or other type of action game that has a really complex animation system and fighting system. And so this particular skill set is somebody who's really good at animation and really needs to understand animation very carefully and understand, all of those kinds of things. Yes, so Mortal Kombat would be a great example of that. In fact, for that TNA wrestling game that I did, our animation director and our guy who was kind of heading all that was actually Sal DeVita. And if you don't know, Sal DeVita was actually the head of the Mortal Kombat animation and art team. So he was working directly with Ed, who was the creator of Mortal Kombat, but Sal was the main guy, like, doing the art side of Mortal Kombat. So I actually got the honor of working with Sal, super amazing guy. And so a lot of what we implemented for TNA wrestling actually came out of how they did things for Mortal Kombat. So just as a funny little side story there. But yeah, they have very similar types of pipelines and processes there. And again, your day-to-day job is just working in this custom editor, just really trying to figure out exactly where everybody is and how they align. And there's lots of little tricks that you have to know, like how to snap something, for example, where some things need to happen over some frames per second, but some things have to happen instantly. So maybe we have to align two characters, but you don't want it to be too bad that way. Def Jam also had a lot of this type of stuff. So any of those kinds of games are going to have what would be called a combat designer. Now let's talk about a multiplayer designer. So a multiplayer designer, again, in some games, the system designer and the multiplayer designer are the same person. Now, what I actually should have done, and I'll apologize, I really should have made two slides here, but I want to segregate actually multiplayer designer into two subgroups. So there's multiplayer systems designer and multiplayer level designer. Now, that being said, I would say that 80% of the jobs that I see when somebody says they're hiring for a multiplayer designer, what 80% of that usually is a level designer, not a system designer. So generally, even if your game has single player and multiplayer, the gameplay systems usually are either 100% shared or 95% shared between multiplayer and single player. So generally, a systems designer is going to be somebody who is going to focus on either multiplayer and single player, and they're going to work on both, right? Because the same systems should be kind of used for both. Now, that being said, I do know some teams that do have some larger teams that do have dedicated multiplayer systems designers who are really trying to make sure that all of the gameplay systems for a multiplayer game are all working, for both single player and multiplayer. But they're specifically double checking, triple checking, balancing, making sure that that they work in both areas. Now, one of the examples of where this gets really difficult is if you look at Destiny, for example. So Bungie Studios, who created Halo originally and things like that, they're one of the biggest, best studios out there. Really great teams. Really big teams, AAA budgets, all that kind of stuff, right? Now in Destiny, they're a bit of a unique hybrid in that they have what's called PvE and PvP. Now, this also comes into play. This same problem comes into a lot of MMORPGs. And this is where it gets tricky and where you sometimes need a multiplayer game systems designer along with a single player game system designer. So if you don't know, PvE is player versus environment, and that means it's really the we'll call it single player, but it's really you against the AI, you against that stuff. It doesn't necessarily always have to be single player, meaning that there is experiences that are hybrids that have other human players and AI characters all in the same game, in the same battle, fighting each other. So PvE is kind of that, where it's really against an AI, and then PvP is against player versus player against other players. But if you do a little bit of research and you read some articles, it actually, if you're into game design, it's a little fascinating to see what's happening. So that the player base in Destiny right now is fracturing, and they're having trouble because the PvE and the PvP parts of the game, these are different modes and they're different games and different things that are happening in the game, and they were designed to be kind of one. But the problem is players level through that game experience. They can earn experience and earn all this stuff in different ways in both modes. And so what started happening is these modes where they were together initially started going like this. And so now what ended up kind of happening was players could progress like in PvP in different ways and better ways than they could in PvE. And so it became like, that there was kind of one way to win, one way to play, that kind of thing. And so, so because of that, they're really struggling right now with their game design. And they're having to really rethink a lot of stuff because these were areas that the systems were originally designed to work together. And what they've kind of realized over time is that these systems really don't work very well together because of the nature of humans and how we play together versus the nature of how an AI works. And shout out to your fellow hunters. Good kitty. And so a lot of Destiny players are very frustrated right now because they're struggling with the differences between the single player and the multiplayer. And so that's just a good example of where a multiplayer designer, systems designer, is sometimes needed to focus on a particular area of multiplayer. Now, more often than not, what you're actually going to see, you're going to get in the multiplayer level designer role is really somebody who's focused on building very specialized multiplayer levels. And as you guys probably know, or hopefully know, or I'll tell you now, multiplayer levels are night and day different than single player levels. And, when you try to create the same world that is both single player and multiplayer, it's a mess, and yes, it can be done. And some open world games try to do that. They make the multiplayer gameplay a little bit more open, a little more free, not quite as precise, and it can kind of work, but that's a challenge. And so but when you see the role of a multiplayer designer being hired for, what that's going to mean probably 9 times out of 10 is that they're looking to build very specialized multiplayer levels. And so they're going to have a team that's going to build the single player levels. They're going to have a team building multiplayer levels, and they're really very distinct things. They may share some work, they may share nothing, but they're really going to be designed from the ground up to be very unique experiences. And so 9 times out of 10, again, when you see the job title multiplayer designer, that's what you're looking for, is this multiplayer level designer. And that job is not too different from a level designer job. But in multiplayer, it's really, 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 really specialized. You really have to know exactly how to build multiplayer levels. You're not going to get involved in story. You're not going to, you're not going to add those types of things to the game, right? You're just you're building these very specialized levels that are for everybody to play on, and they have their own rules, their own specialties, and stuff like that. And so it tends to be a lot more of like working on the same level for a much longer period of time. Whereas like in single player games, you may tend to work on one level and then move on to the next and move on to the next. Whereas in that same time period, a multiplayer designer may just work on one level for a really long time trying to get it right. Because it requires a lot more iteration, a lot more play balance, that kind of stuff. And so this is a role that needs some artistic ability, but you're going to be, again, really looking and analyzing every little tiny thing of the game and trying to really understand how the players are going to play well on this map together. And so that's something that's tends to be very specialized. Now, this is probably one of the rarest of the game designer job roles, but I do want to bring it up. This is more often than not the job of the game systems designer. But when you get into MMORPGs, especially, and some RPGs, and now I would say some mobile games, where the game economies, especially when you get real people involved together, game economies tend to get bad very quickly. And so human nature is always such that when people play together, they mess with each other. And unfortunately, it's really true. In a lot of game economies, especially in MMORPGs like WoW, a lot of them mimic real world economies closer than you'd think. And in fact, there's been a number of MMORPGs that have actually hired real world economists, not game economists, real world economists, to help them balance inflation, help them balance like all this stuff, in the game. And so be aware of this particular job as somebody that's got to be incredibly like spreadsheet savvy. Like you got to be like sleeping with a laptop and Excel running on it under your bed, under your pillow. Like, this is just going to be like 100% working in Excel. Knowing how to write formulas and knowing how to really look deeply at like every little teeny tiny thing that goes on there. And so if you're not a numbers person, this is not about being fun at all. This is about, the economy of the game and how to balance it. How much things cost, the types of resources that stuff go in there, how things change over time, all these kind of things, trying to forecast out stuff and then be able to take data, analyze data, run SQL queries, things like that. So this job is a very different job as a game designer. Now, it does help to be a game designer to do this job, and so, but again, I've seen people just hire pure economists to do this role. But, again, I would say that 75 to 80% of the time, this is a role that is part of the game system designer role, and generally is not put into its own job description unless the game or the team is really big, right? Or the economy is really, really, really complicated, like an MMORPG. So this is a bit of a rarer job in the game designer job roles. Now, this is probably, arguably, I would say maybe the biggest role in game design when it comes to the opportunities. And this is one of the reasons why I teach this in my course. I think this is the world or level designer roles that you can see both titles being used are generally the most common role that are seen in games as far as entry level roles. And I think this is generally the best place for you to get started if you're interested in getting into game design. Now, this role, like any game design role, is complicated in that you generally will do better at this role. So, Drawn Skull, like this is one particular area with you having an interest in art and I'm assuming some art skills. This is one of those roles where if you have a really strong art background, you'll really thrive better. Now, you don't have to have any art skills at all, but it does help you considerably if you do have art skills here. And so that's one of those fine lines where you have to figure out through your particular company and projects, pipeline and processes, what is your job going to be versus what is a level artist going to be. And so usually on most teams, there's going to be what we often call a pod or a group of people. And that could be two of you, a level designer and a level artist. But there could be a larger group. It could be a couple people. I've seen teams where it's like one level designer and three, level artists or whatever. So there's lots of ways to skin the proverbial cat. But in the end, a level designer is generally the person who you're going to start off on paper and you're going to be the person who's going to kind of spec out like what this level is going to be, what's going to go in it, what's the gameplay that's going to be in it. You work with the system designer who's also telling you like, hey, you can run, you can jump, you can fly, you can drive cars, you got these weapons, you got all this kind of stuff. So you have to disseminate all this system design stuff, which you may or may not be involved in from the start. And then you have to somehow make the world. You have to make the world come alive, right? And so, and that's going to be, how does it look visually? How is that going to be fun? Does it have quests? Does it have story? Does it have characters? What goes where and who and why and how big is it? And what's going on and where is the player traveling to and all these kind of things. And so this is for me, is a really fun role, just because you get to work with so many kind of different aspects, so many different things in the game. But one of the challenges is it's also the last stop, kind of before the game is done. And so the problem is the snowball starts rolling down the hill, and that snowball is first creating gameplay systems, and then they're programming them, and then people are making art, and the snowball is getting bigger and bigger over time as more content is being created, right? But quite often in level design, you can't start until the snowball is a certain size or a certain configuration. Meaning, you may not be able to even start doing a lot of things until more of the game is figured out. And so the problem is you might pencil in and say like, well, we got 6 months to say make all these levels. And so you think, well, it's going to take me 2 months per level, so I can get 3 levels done in 6 months. But unfortunately, you look up and you see that snowball heading for you, and you're like, oh crap, it's not going to be here on time, or oh man, it's too big, or it's too small, or it's something. And I would say that 95% of the time that I've worked as a level designer, when it came time for me to start, when I needed to start building, I was waiting for something and really couldn't go 100% into it. And so you're waiting for all these things to happen, and it really messes with you, right? And so it's a really big challenge. And so that's one of the problems with being kind of the last guy, the person that's going to make and assemble that final game together, is you're just waiting for so many things to be finished, so many things to be done. And then if those don't come in on time, you get screwed, right? So just be aware of that, that's one of the biggest challenges. So you have to find ways to work in white boxes, work on paper, concept things out, and that kind of stuff in order to really make sure that your level designer job can get done on time, or your levels can get done on time and on budget and things like that. And the difference of like a level artist is the level artist is just going to build the art. They're going to build the buildings, the trees, the rocks, whatever it is that you're going to be placing. And so depending on how your level is built, a lot of levels are modular assets. A lot of levels are like Lego bricks, kind of, in essence. You're gonna build some things. You got to wait for that stuff to be built, and then you get to go place it down. But in a process, in a pipeline things, a lot of times the problem is if the level artist generally has more art skills, he may be actually the final person to go in. So you may take your level and rough it out, and then a level artist may come in behind you and like flesh it out fully. So you kind of put in like where the roads are, where the buildings kind of are, and things like that. And then a level artist needs to go in after you and make it pretty as a level designer. And that's about half the time that process incurs. And so that's why you're working very, very closely with a level artist as you're going back and forth. Now, as a level designer, though, some teams have hired like guys who basically have a lot of art skills. And so they expect you as a level designer to also do the level artist job. So the level artist may only create the base asset, and then they expect you as a level designer to actually place everything in the editor, in the world, where it's needed. And so that means every rock, every tree, every bush is set down by, it's not modeled and textured, but it's placed in that world by a level designer. And so if you're looking to get a level designer job, you do need to make sure that you're getting, that you have the right skill sets, because I've actually had a couple cases where the executive team or whoever told me to go out and hire, for example, guys who are going to be artistic, because they wanted the level designer to be the final guy, and he was going to have to place all the things down and make that level look really pretty and all that. So I went and hired a bunch of guys who basically were ex-artists who had art background, who were good level designers. And I hired an entire team one time at EA for that. And then the executives came in and went, nah, we want the level designers actually to do more scripting and do more of the technical work. And we're going to have the level artists be the guys who make the final art polish. And so I literally had to fire my entire team that I'd only hired weeks before and hire all new guys with totally different skill sets. And so be careful about that and make sure that you have the right amount of technical and artistic skill set, you know, when you're doing that, right? Because it definitely has bit me in the butt a few times where it wasn't my fault, but again, the requirements for the project changed and ultimately, you know, kind of messed us up. Now, we'll talk about events or mission designer briefly. This is another specialty subset that only typically exists on larger teams and or larger projects. And typically the events or mission designers are a role that are just focused on quests. And so they are people who are going to build and implement all of the story-driven quests in the game. And so these people quite often have maybe some good to great writing skills. That doesn't mean there's not a writer on the team, but they generally can do a first pass on writing a lot of, especially secondary dialogues and stories and quest lines, things like that. They usually have some technical skills because there's a lot of scripting and things like that involved in building out all these quests and missions and things like that, and setting up all the events and triggers and all that kind of things. And so if you see, you know, event designers or mission designers, quest designers, any role that's like that, what they're really wanting, again, is somebody who's very specialized. You may be working again with a partner who is a level designer, and you guys may be working as a very close team, but you know, that level designer more often than not is the guy actually building the physical level, the physical world, and then you're just basically scripting the events and scripting all the stuff that's happening, the action, you know, the technical stuff that's happening, the story stuff and those things, and you're implementing the gameplay, you know, on top of that level. Whereas the other guys, you know, so there's these hybrids between kind of like who's creating interactivity versus who's creating art, right? And who's designing things in theory versus who's implementing things. And so that's where this particular role, you know, kind of crosses that boundary. Now, a couple times, this is not a very common role either. You'll see content designers. Content designers are typically people who are creating all the content for the game. This can be seen, again, in like MMORPGs, RPGs, mobile games, and certain types of games especially that are going to rely on a lot of content. And so these might be guys who are working, again, with artists, not level artists, but artists. And they're going to be people who are, for example, you know, implementing new weapons, new gear, new armor sets, those kinds of things, right? And so content designers quite often are ones that are implementing that stuff, and then they're going to also make sure, working with the system designers or doing the work themselves, to make sure that these things are balanced, that these things aren't going to mess up the leveling of the game or like anything else detrimental in the game. And so again, these roles are not quite as common to be seen, but they are something that you do occasionally see, this role of content designer, and your job is usually just to implement a lot of things into the game and make sure that they're in there and that they're working and don't break the game. So the next thing is what we call technical designers. And sometimes you'll see the job description scripter. So you might see a job as far as like a gameplay scripter or game design scripter. Technical game designer is probably the more common name, but there's lots of variants that you occasionally see within this role. So what these companies are usually looking for is somebody who's very technical, but that doesn't mean that you have to be a programmer. Now, quite often they will try to hire people who are programmers. They'll try to hire people who, or at least were partially programming or got a programming degree or have some stronger programming backgrounds. But not always, right? And so, these technical designers are going to be writing scripts. They're going to be implementing gameplay. They're going to be helping the level designers. They're going to be helping all these other designers do their jobs. But they're a bridge between the engineers and the design team. And so they're generally working, again, in like Python, Lua, Unreal Script, some sort of technical language that's quite often a visual language versus a pure, text-based language like C or C++, right? And so again, these people could be full-blown engineers, but they're also usually people that have some game design sense, knowledge, training. And so, so you need to be aware of that as well, that these people sometimes are implementing, say, weapons or other types of things. Like I've had, technical designers who were fairly competent in like basic programming, and they could, for example, implement, the weapons themselves or things like that. Or a programmer might set up a template or something that they can kind of just go in and modify a little bit, and then they can, change the stats, and stuff. And so again, these are designers who have some technical ability, and again, but don't have to necessarily be a full-blown engineer or full-blown programmer. And they really are part of the design team, not part of the, the engineering team. In a similar way, you'll also see there's technical artists or tech artists. Those are also bridge the same gap, right, between, design and engineering, or art and engineering, and they may even be another role that these guys often also do is a lot of scripting for setting up like workflow enhancements, pipeline improvements, setting up like scripts for you to be able to do things like faster, stuff like that. There's generally like one or two of these on most projects. They're generally not a very common role, but you find somebody again that can help the designers work better, faster. So for example, like I've had projects on, say, like Munch's Odyssey or something where, I needed to do, as a game designer, I needed to do a lot of scripting, and I needed to write scripts. They had a proprietary scripting language kind of similar to Lua that they used. And so it was all text-based. And, if I had written that from scratch, I probably could have, but it was, it wasn't worth my time. And so we had a technical designer who would go in and write the first script for me, and then all I had to do is then go in and like change names, change numbers, and things like that, and allowed me to work a lot faster, right? So that was a way for me to optimize my time as a game designer. Now, the writers, you could argue whether a writer is part of the design team or not. I argue that, and I usually place my design team, my writers in my design team. And I do think they're an instrumental part of the design team. I think they need to be part of all the design discussions and really need to be part of that whole world building process and everything else. But writers can either be like a full-time person on your project if you're at a big company, but they're often just a consultant who's going to come in and write things, for you once the game is kind of partially done or things like that. So be careful, on understanding like who does what writing, because again, a level designer may be expected to do a bunch of writing, so you may have a writer come in and write the core story and like the cutscenes and the really big stuff. But then like when it comes to like quests and things like that, you as a level designer might be the guy actually writing, the minute to minute kind of like subquests and, things like that. You may be writing the dialogue for those kinds of things and stuff. So the role and the job of a writer quite often is very similar to like I said, those content designers or to the level designers. But they're just, again, purely either writing dialogue from scratch or polishing, more often than not, a lot of dialogue that somebody else wrote initially, and then they're trying to figure out how to just make it work good. The problem in the pipeline here, really quick, guys, is that as a writer, things take time. And another problem to be aware of is localization. So in AAA console games, one of the problems is that quite often we have to lock our script quite often like 2 months before the game ships, because we need time to say, we might write our script in English, but now we need to have like German, French, Spanish, Chinese, whatever, other languages that this game is going to launch in day one. And those all have to launch simultaneously with a lot of companies. So, if I have to lock my script like 2 months ahead of time, and sometimes my level design doesn't start until 4 months before the end of the project, I start to get into this weird bottleneck where like I've got to get certain things written, but I have to get it written soon enough, and then what happens if I need to make changes? So what happens if they come up with a bug? What happens if I just have a writer on temporarily, and they may write a bunch of dialogue, that can be great, but at the same time, they may go away if they're a contractor and then leave me by myself. And then the last minute I've got to make changes and so on and so forth. And so having some ability as a game designer, especially a level designer or quest designer, to be a good writer can definitely help you a lot. The next area of game design that's really specialized is kind of in the UI UX or interface design or usability designers. And so this is another one of these multifaceted areas where the interface design needs an artist who's going to make it look pretty. And these often are different roles, right? So there's often an artist who is going to make the interface look really pretty. There's a usability designer who's going to make sure that the interface is easy to use, that you know how to use it, that it's fun to use, that it's efficient, all these kinds of things. And then there's a gameplay designer, who's going to make sure that it works with the game. And so the gameplay designer, the usability designer, and the artist, all three kind of working in tandem to usually try to make the interface really great. We're talking both the front end interfaces and the in-game interfaces. And this is especially important in mobile games, but it's still important in PC console as well. And the trick or the challenge here is that these are three different skill sets, and occasionally you'll find somebody who can do all three, but often they're three different roles, and trying to find strong people in all three of these roles can be really challenging. But what a lot of people forget is that the game designer part of this needs to be very integral. So they may hire like an interface designer who just goes off and like creates some interface, and he doesn't understand what that means from the game design perspective. And it has to be this back and forth to really make a great UI. It's really hard, and it's very multifaceted with a lot of different skill sets in it. And so you do need to be aware of that this particular role, that this person that might be a gameplay designer. So let me say it this way, there may be a game systems designer here who's working with the UI UX designers, but there also can be a UX designer or a usability designer who's kind of a gameplay designer, and game designer, and interface usability designer, all kind of wrapped up in one, and then the artist. And so again, there could be a couple different skill sets here that you have to kind of figure out, like which of those, do you fit into, or who's handling what, on your teams. Now, we'll mention product managers, or PMs as they're often called. We talked a bit about this last week in the producer episode, but really the product manager is really, I consider them part of the design team. And I think they're the people who are there to collect the data. They write SQL queries. They look at your focus testing, usability testing, bug testing, open beta testing, your live consumer, data, all that kind of stuff. And they're basically collecting data, generating reports, and giving that to the design team. And they're making recommendations on what new features need to be changed or added or done or whatever. And so the product managers are becoming more and more a very integral part of the design team, more specifically in mobile and free-to-play games. So not so much so in more commercialized software. But don't forget about the product managers, because they are an important. Data analytics just in general is becoming more and more important to game designers every day, right? So don't overlook data analytics in general. We talked a little bit about senior lead designers in the beginning. Since we're just about out of time, I'll kind of glaze over this, but these are, again, guys that are going to take on more and more of the game, and they're going to have either the entirety of the game or a bigger chunk of the game over them, and they're taking on more leadership, management type stuff, more schedules, and doing, say, one-on-ones with their design teams, and just keeping the interpersonal stuff working together. But otherwise, they're generally doing kind of the same general job as a game designer, but again, they've just taken on a little bit more on the management side. A design director is an interesting title, because I've seen this fit in a couple different companies in different ways. And so some bigger teams have recognized that they need a design director who's going to be over the design team in kind of some of the ways that a lead designer or senior designer that I was talking about function, in the management of the team, management of their careers, management maybe of their schedules, but really about their interpersonal day-to-day workings, their career growths and stuff like that. And so those types of people, the design directors, are sometimes somebody who's one sec. Put my email in here for that. So So the design director can either be head of the design department and kind of overseeing everything, or they can be somebody who's only focused on the career development of the team. And so they may not be involved in the project at all. So if you go to like Sony Santa Monica or a team like that, their design director is not involved in the day-to-day of that project, like God of War at all. They are purely focused on the interpersonal workings and day-to-day lives of game designers. But when you have, 25, 50, 100 game designers on your team, that's what's going to happen. And so studios like Sony, Blizzard, companies like that are a little bit bigger, they're going to have design directors that are really just focused on that particular thing. You're welcome, Dream Skull. Drawn Skull, I guess. And but they're also, and some teams might also just be like heading the design for the project. So just be aware of this is the same title used in a couple different ways, and it just depends on the design director and the creative director are often confused, and sometimes they're servicing the same roles or doing the same thing. Sometimes they're not. So you do have to be a little bit careful about this particular job title, how it's used. So if you have a design director on your team and you're working under one or with one, try to find out what they're working on, because sometimes it may be a little bit different. And then the creative director or project lead, is we talked about this person last week, is really the person running the project creatively. So I won't go into detail today, but they're kind of like usually the top person on the team. It may be with or either in conjunction with an executive producer or some other kind of C-level executive or something. Creative directors are usually the person overseeing the creative of the entire project in some way, shape, or form. So that's it. That's the different roles within the game design team. And sorry, I kind of go a little bit fast there in the end and kind of blaze through. I wanted to spend a little bit more time so you guys understood. It's yeah, hopefully, Kitty, one of these days you'll have a boss's boss's boss. Hopefully not too many more bosses above that, though. That's where it gets crazy. But hopefully this gave you guys a good understanding of just kind of what a game designer does, all the different types of roles in a game designer, all the different types of things you can do as a game designer. And, as you can see, it's very, very, multifaceted, right? There's lots of, fun skills, lots of art skills, lots of technical skills, and everything in between. So, again, please, reach out if you guys have questions. I'm always happy to do my best to answer them, for you guys. And otherwise, hopefully next week we will see you all here again, and we'll find another topic next week to entertain you all. And again, thank you all very much, Kitty especially, for always being here. Love having you. And just trying to hopefully get you guys to kind of understand this. Because again, keep in mind, even if you're an artist, even if you're an engineer, the game designer is a guy that you're going to have to deal with every day. And most of us are kind of jerks, so you got to figure out how to put up with this day to day. So it's good to understand what we do, so you understand how all the puzzle pieces kind of fit together in this world. So again, thank you all very much. I appreciate you spending your valuable time with me, and I look forward to seeing you all next week. So take care, be safe, and have a great week.